Mohammad Mosaddegh was the democratically elected Prime Minister of Iran. In 1951, he nationalized Iran's oil industry, taking control away from the British-owned Anglo-Iranian Oil Company. This directly threatened British economic interests as they had dominated Iran's oil production and profits for decades. Britain responded by seeking Mossadegh's removal and pressuring the United States to support action against him. Initially, the U.S. remained cautious, but as Cold War tensions intensified, American leadership grew concerned that political instability in Iran could push it towards Soviet influence. This shift in perspective led to direct involvement. In 1953, the CIA, working with British intelligence, launched Operation Ajax. The operation involved funding street protests, spreading propaganda, and bribing key political and military figures within Iran. The objective was to destabilize Mossadegh's government and create conditions for his removal. The first attempt to overthrow Mossadegh failed, and he briefly maintained control. However, a second coordinated effort succeeded within days. Military units loyal to the Shah moved in, seized control, and Mossadegh was arrested. Mohammad Reza Pahlavi, who had fled Iran during the unrest, returned and was reinstated as the country's ruler. Following the coup, Iran shifted from a constitutional political system to a more authoritarian monarchy aligned with Western interests. Mossadegh was placed under house arrest for the remainder of his life. The United States secured greater influence over Iran's political direction and oil resources. Ngo Diem was the president of South Vietnam from 1955 to 1963. He was initially supported by the United States as a strong anti-communist leader during the early stages of the Vietnam conflict. Over time, his government became increasingly authoritarian. Political opposition was suppressed, and his administration faced growing criticism, particularly from the Buddhist majority, who protested religious discrimination. These internal tensions weakened his legitimacy. As instability increased, U.S. officials began to lose confidence in Diem's ability to maintain control and effectively counter communist forces in North Vietnam. American leadership started signaling support for alternative leadership within the South Vietnamese military. In November 1963, South Vietnamese generals organized a coup. The operation was carried out by local military forces, but it occurred with the knowledge and tacit approval of the United States. Diem captured along with his brother Ngo while attempting to escape. Both were assassinated shortly after being taken into custody. Following his removal, South Vietnam entered a period of political instability with frequent leadership changes. The situation weakened the government's position and deepened U.S. involvement in the Vietnam War. Patrice Lumumba was the first prime minister of the newly independent Democratic Republic of the Congo in 1960. He played a central role in leading the country to independence from Belgium and quickly became a symbol of national unity and anti-colonial leadership. Soon after independence, the country descended into crisis. The mineral-rich Katanga region attempted to secede with Belgian support, and the National Army mutinied. Lumumba sought international assistance to stabilize the country. When Western powers were slow to respond, he turned to the Soviet Union for support. This move alarmed the United States during the Cold War. American officials viewed Lumumba as a potential ally of the USSR, raising fears that the Congo could fall under Soviet influence. As a result, the U.S. began supporting political rivals within the country. Colonel Mobutu Sese Seko, backed by Western interests, led a coup that removed Lumumba from power in late 1960. Lumumba was placed under house arrest, but later attempted to escape to regain control. He was captured by opposing forces, transferred to Katanga, and in January 1961, he was executed. His death was carried out by local actors, but it occurred in a context where U.S. and Belgian involvement had contributed to his removal and isolation. Following his assassination, Mobutu eventually consolidated power and established a long-standing regime aligned with Western interests. Saddam Hussein was the president of Iraq from 1979 to 2003. He maintained a highly centralized and authoritarian government, and his regime had previously been involved in regional conflicts, including the Iran-Iraq War and the invasion of Kuwait. In the early 2000s, the United States accused Iraq of possessing weapons of mass destruction and supporting terrorism. These claims were used to justify increasing pressure on Saddam's government, although such weapons were not found after the invasion. In March 2003, the United States, along with coalition forces, launched a military invasion of Iraq. The operation, often referred to as shock and awe, involved large-scale airstrikes, followed by a ground offensive aimed at rapidly dismantling the Iraqi government. Iraqi military resistance collapsed within weeks, and Baghdad fell to coalition forces. Saddam Hussein went into hiding as his government was effectively dismantled. In December 2003, he was captured by U.S. forces near his hometown of Tikrit, where he was found hiding in an underground shelter. He was later handed over to Iraqi authorities, tried, and executed in 2006. His removal led to the complete collapse of the existing Iraqi state structure and triggered years of conflict, instability, and insurgency within the country. Manuel Noriega was the de facto leader of Panama during the 1980s and had previously maintained a working relationship with the United States, including cooperation with intelligence agencies. Over time, relations deteriorated as he was accused of drug trafficking, corruption, and undermining democratic processes in Panama. In 1989, tensions escalated after disputed elections and increasing instability within the country. The United States also indicted Noriega on drug trafficking charges, further intensifying the conflict between his government and U.S. authorities. In December 1989, the United States launched a full-scale military invasion of Panama called Operation Just Cause. The stated objectives included protecting American citizens, restoring democratic governance, and capturing Noriega. U.S. forces quickly overwhelmed Panamanian defenses and took control of key locations. Noriega initially went into hiding and sought refuge in the Vatican Embassy in Panama City. After several days of pressure and negotiations, he surrendered to U.S. forces. He was taken to the United States, where he was put on trial and later convicted on drug-related charges. Following his removal, a new government aligned with U.S. interests was installed in Panama. Sukarno was the founding president of Indonesia and a central figure in the country's independence movement. By the mid-1960s, he governed through a system called guided democracy, balancing power between the military, nationalist groups, and the Indonesian Communist Party, PKI. Indonesia held major strategic importance during the Cold War due to its size, location, and resources. Sukarno maintained relations with both Western countries and communist states, but his growing tolerance of the PKI raised concerns in the United States. American officials feared Indonesia could shift toward communism. In 1965, a group of military officers was killed in a mysterious incident known as the September 30th movement. The Indonesian army, led by Suharto, blamed the PKI for the incident. This triggered a massive anti-communist purge across the country. The United States provided support to the Indonesian military during this period, including intelligence and lists of suspected communists. Hundreds of thousands of people were killed in the violence that followed, as the army consolidated control. Sukarno's authority rapidly declined as Suharto gained power. By 1967, Sukarno was formally removed from the presidency and placed under house arrest. Suharto established a new regime that aligned more closely with Western interests. Sukarno remained under restriction until his death. King Constantine II was the king of Greece during a period of intense political instability in the 1960s. Greece was a key strategic ally for the United States during the Cold War, and preventing a left-wing government from gaining power was a major priority for Western interests. In April 1967, a group of right-wing military officers launched a coup to seize control of the government. The coup was carried out quickly, with tanks deployed in Athens and political opponents arrested overnight. The objective was to block the rise of a perceived leftist government. Although the coup was organized by Greek military leaders, it took place within a broader Cold War environment where the United States supported anti-communist forces in the region. The new regime, known as the regime of the colonels, aligned itself with Western interests. King Constantine II initially accepted the new government, hoping to maintain stability and retain influence. However, later in 1967, he attempted a counter-coup to regain control. The attempt failed due to lack of military support. Constantine was forced to flee the country and went into exile. The military remained in power for several years, ruling Greece as an authoritarian state. Nicolás Maduro has been the president of Venezuela since 2013, succeeding Hugo Chavez. His government faced prolonged economic collapse, hyperinflation, and widespread political unrest. The United States accused his administration of corruption, authoritarian practices, and involvement in drug trafficking. In 2020, the U.S. Department of Justice formally charged Maduro with narco-terrorism and offered a reward for information leading to his arrest. Sanctions were imposed on Venezuela, targeting its economy and key officials in an effort to pressure his government. Tensions escalated over the following years as political divisions deepened inside Venezuela. The U.S. supported opposition figures and recognized alternative leadership claims, increasing diplomatic and economic pressure on Maduro's administration. In January 2026, U.S. forces conducted a direct operation in Caracas. Maduro was captured during the operation and taken into U.S. custody. This marked a rare instance of a sitting head of state being physically seized by another country. João Goulart was the president of Brazil from 1961 to 1964. He pursued policies focused on land reform, wealth redistribution, and greater state control over key industries. These measures were seen as left-leaning and raised concerns among conservative groups within Brazil. During the Cold War, the United States viewed Goulart's government as potentially drifting towards socialism. American officials feared that Brazil, one of the largest countries in Latin America, could align with communist interests if his policies continued. In 1964, opposition within Brazil's military began organizing against Goulart. The United States provided support through diplomatic backing and logistical preparation under a plan known as Operation Brother Sam. This included positioning naval forces nearby and ensuring fuel and supplies would be available to coup leaders if needed. As military pressure increased, Goulart lost support from key political and military figures. Rather than initiate armed resistance, he chose to leave the country to avoid civil war. He went into exile, and the military took control of the government. A military dictatorship was established and remained in power for over 2 decades. The new regime aligned closely with U.S. interests and reversed many of Goulart's reforms. The removal of Goulart became a significant example of U.S. support for military coups during the Cold War, particularly in Latin America, where preventing the spread of leftist governments was a primary objective. Salvador Allende was the president of Chile from 1970 to 1973 and the first Marxist leader elected through democratic elections in Latin America. He introduced policies that included nationalizing key industries such as copper, expanding social programs, and redistributing wealth. These actions created strong opposition both within Chile and internationally. The United States viewed Allende's government as a potential expansion of Soviet influence in the Western Hemisphere during the Cold War. Economic pressure was applied, including efforts to restrict financial support and destabilize the Chilean economy. At the same time, internal opposition grew among business groups, political parties, and sections of the military. Strikes, protests, and economic disruption increased, weakening the government's stability. On September 11, 1973, the Chilean military, led by Augusto Pinochet, launched a coup. Military forces surrounded and bombed the presidential palace, La Moneda. Allende remained inside the palace during the assault and died as the military took control. His death marked the end of his government and the beginning of military rule. Pinochet assumed power and established a dictatorship that lasted for years, aligning Chile more closely with Western interests. Jacobo Arbenz was the democratically elected president of Guatemala. He came to power in 1951 and introduced land reforms aimed at redistributing unused land to poor farmers. A major portion of this land belonged to the US-based United Fruit Company, which had significant economic influence in the country. The reforms directly threatened United Fruit's holdings, and the company lobbied the US government to act. At the same time, the United States viewed Arbenz's policies as potentially sympathetic to communism, especially in the context of the Cold War. This combination of economic and ideological concerns led to a decision to remove him. In 1954, the CIA launched Operation PBSUCCESS, a covert mission to destabilize Arbenz's government. The operation involved psychological warfare, radio propaganda, and support for a small rebel force led by Carlos Castillo Armas. Although the rebel army was relatively weak, the perception of a larger invading force created panic within Guatemala. The U.S. also applied diplomatic and economic pressure while signaling support for military opposition inside the country. Guatemalan military leaders, fearing escalation and lacking confidence in resisting U.S. backing, withdrew their support for Arbenz. Facing internal collapse and external pressure, Arbenz resigned in June 1954. He went into exile, and Castillo Armas took power with U.S. backing. Guatemala shifted away from its reformist policies and moved toward a more authoritarian system. The coup led to long-term instability, including decades of civil conflict and violence. Juan José Torres was the president of Bolivia from 1970 to 1971. He came to power after a period of political instability and positioned himself as a left-leaning nationalist leader, promoting worker participation, national control of resources, and closer ties with socialist countries. During the Cold War, Bolivia's political direction became a concern for the United States. Torres' policies and openness to leftist movements were viewed as a potential shift toward communist influence in South America. In 1971, opposition forces within the Bolivian military, led by General Hugo Banzer, organized a coup against Torres. The movement was supported by conservative groups and sectors of the military that opposed his reforms. The United States backed anti-leftist elements in the region during this period, and while the coup itself was carried out by Bolivian forces, it occurred within a broader context of U.S. support for regimes that opposed socialist governments. As the coup advanced, Torres lost military support and was forced to flee the country. He went into exile and Banzer assumed power, establishing a military dictatorship. Torres remained in exile for several years before being assassinated in 1976 in Argentina as part of Operation Condor, a coordinated effort among South American dictatorships to eliminate political opponents. Mullah Muhammad Omar was the founder of the Taliban and served as the de facto leader of Afghanistan from 1996 to 2001. His government provided sanctuary to Osama bin Laden and al-Qaeda, which became a central issue in U.S. foreign policy. Following the September 11 attacks, the United States demanded that the Taliban hand over bin Laden. The Taliban refused, leading to a direct military response. In October 2001, the United States launched an invasion of Afghanistan, working alongside Allied forces and Afghan opposition groups known as the Northern Alliance. The objective was to dismantle al-Qaeda and remove the Taliban from power. Within weeks, Taliban control collapsed in major cities including Kabul. The government led by Mullah Omar was effectively removed, and a new political structure, backed by the United States, was established. Mullah Omar fled and went into hiding as U.S. forces continued operations across the country. His death was later confirmed in 2015, although it had occurred earlier while he was still in hiding. The removal of his government marked the beginning of a prolonged conflict in Afghanistan and a major shift in U.S. military involvement in the region. Muammar Gaddafi was the leader of Libya from 1969 to 2011, ruling the country for over 4 decades. His government maintained strict control over political life, and opposition was heavily suppressed. Over time, his rule became increasingly isolated internationally. In 2011, during the broader wave of uprisings known as the Arab Spring, protests broke out across Libya. Demonstrations quickly escalated into an armed conflict between Gaddafi's forces and opposition groups. As the situation intensified, the United Nations authorized military intervention to protect civilians. The United States, along with NATO allies, carried out airstrikes against Libyan government forces, targeting military infrastructure and weakening Gaddafi's control. The intervention significantly shifted the balance of power on the ground. Rebel forces advanced across the country, eventually taking control of the capital, Tripoli. Gaddafi fled as his government collapsed, but was later captured by opposition fighters near Sirte in October 2011. He was killed shortly after being taken into custody. Following his removal, Libya entered a prolonged period of instability, with competing factions struggling for control. This case represents a form of regime change where U.S. involvement came through coordinated international military intervention rather than a unilateral invasion. Viktor Yanukovych was the president of Ukraine from 2010 to 2014. His administration maintained close ties with Russia and faced growing opposition from groups that supported stronger integration with Europe. In late 2013, Yanukovych decided to suspend an association agreement with the European Union, choosing instead to pursue closer economic relations with Russia. The United States supported pro-European elements in Ukraine and called for political reforms while also applying diplomatic pressure during the crisis. Western officials were actively engaged in discussions surrounding Ukraine's political future. In February 2014, violence peaked in Kyiv, and Yanukovych lost support from key political allies and security forces. He fled the capital and later left the country. Ukraine's parliament voted to remove him from office, and a new government was formed. His removal marked a major geopolitical shift, increasing tensions between Russia and Western countries. This event became a significant turning point in Eastern Europe, leading to ongoing conflict and highlighting the role of external influence in internal political transitions.